Good evening. Welcome to our webinar. This evening we're talking about anxiety and particularly how it relates to children and young people with ADHD. Most of us suffer from anxiety sometime in our life, and this is often caused by different aspects or circumstances. Although this evening we thought we would cover the situation with the current lockdown with COVID-19, and particularly how it affects our families and children with ADHD. We're very fortunate to have two very well qualified speakers who can talk to us this evening, and hopefully you will leave the seminar having learned more about what anxiety really is, and also possible practical strategies in terms of helping your children and also the whole family. With that, I'm going to welcome our two speakers. We've got Dr. Tamsin Owen, who is Deputy Head of the Emotional Health Service at Achieving for Children. She's a clinical psychologist, and she's also joined with her colleague, G.Armstrong, who's an assistant psychologist who will be covering the topic. So with that, I'm going to hand you over to Tamsin. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Annette, and for inviting us along today. It's a topic that is very, very high on everyone's agenda at the moment, managing anxiety during this particular time and strange experience that we're all in. So thank you for giving up your valuable evening to come along and listen to this. What we're planning to cover, oh dear, no, hold on. There we go. Is just first of all looking at a very brief background about what anxiety is, and then thinking about anxiety and ADHD, how to notice anxiety in your child, which is a big challenge and may present itself in all sorts of different ways. And then we're going to think about some of the strategies that you can use to help both younger and older children in managing that anxiety. And we're going to look at managing COVID-specific anxieties, but also just more generalised anxieties, because there are an awful lot of anxieties relating to various different issues, which might not be coronavirus specific, but for example, going back to school. We're also going to think about some resources that might be available, and lastly, but definitely not least, is making sure that everyone is looking after themselves, which is challenging in this time, but really important to make sure that we're trying to do. And then, as Annette said, there'll be an opportunity to talk about some of your questions at the end. Right, so we all know that humans will experience different fears at various points in their lives, and it's all part of normal development. In fact, it's something that will continue into old age for all of us. It's a very normal feeling, and it's expected, and particularly in response to stress. And it's a necessary and important cue to help us to adapt and cope and to develop as human beings. So actually, anxiety and stress can be helpful, and it can be short, and it can be mild, or it can be very long-term, chronic, and very intense and uncomfortable experience. And it can cause a great deal of stress and place very real restrictions on life. So as I was saying, a moderate amount of anxiety can help us to do well. So for example, if we've got an exam coming up, anxiety will make us study. If we're crossing a road, a mild amount of anxiety will help us make sure we look both ways. Keeps us safe and protected. But too much or too little anxiety will lower our performance, and too much anxiety can be really unpleasant and can affect our mood. I'm sure you've all heard of the fight, flight, freeze response to danger, but just to briefly mention, anxiety is part of that, and it goes dates right back to when we were cavemen and women living with very real dangerous threats of live animals, saber-toothed tigers, whatever that might be, and it was our body's mechanism of keeping us alive, and it's a very physical reaction of the body to prepare us to either fight or flight. So our heart rate will increase, we'll sweat, our pupils will dilate, and these are all experiences that people will know about when they're experiencing anxiety. But because it is so normal and so natural as a part of life, it's important for us to think about when we should see it as a problem. So there are three main points here. First of all, is if it's causing a significant amount of distress for you. So if it feels uncontrollable and is getting in the way of your life. And another thing to think about is whether or not it's irrational. So sometimes our anxieties can become really very blown up, and we start worrying about things that we don't need to be worrying about. So whether or not it's irrational is an important thing to think about. The second thing is it interfering with a young person's life? So is it affecting their mood to a great level? Is it making them fearful of doing certain things? And lastly, is it causing avoidance? So that's a very common feature of anxiety, is if we stop doing things that we previously used to do because we're worried about doing them. So for example, stopping seeing friends because we're worried about how to talk to them, social anxiety, for example. Now, these are very challenging times, and we probably have people falling into a number of different categories here, children and adults alike. So it might be that your child had anxiety before lockdown and before all this happened. And if that's the case, it might be that the current situation has made the anxiety worse. It might be that the current situation has made the anxiety better, actually, because a lot of young people within our service are telling us that their main sources of anxiety, so for example, school and social relationships, are gone now. But then there's going to be the issue of them returning back to school. There might be anxiety specifically about the coronavirus, or about the impact that it's having on families, jobs, and the health of families. And so the really important thing to say, and for us all to remember, is that there's definitely likely to be a very natural increase in anxiety for many people at a time like this. Of course there's going to be, and that's very normal and understandable. So that's worth bearing in mind when you're thinking about, is there an increase in anxiety for your child? Could we consider it to be normal in this very abnormal time? I'm going to hand you over to Gemma now to talk specifically about ADHD and anxiety.
So we know that anxiety is more common of children who have ADHD than it is in children who do not have ADHD. Some of the behaviours we see typically in children with ADHD are the same as those associated with anxiety. So things like struggling to pay attention and fidgeting, having to move around a lot, get off their seats. So the reason for this is because children with ADHD tend to have difficulties with their executive functioning, which is our skills to do with organisation and time management. So because these skills are a little bit more difficult for children with ADHD, it's the sort of daily planning and timing, trying to organise that type of thing is a lot more stressful for children with ADHD, so that heightens their anxiety. And in addition to that, we know that children with ADHD also struggle to manage their emotions, so it can mean that they become flooded with emotions and struggle to make sense of any negative thoughts or worries that they might be having.
So that's important to highlight, I guess, because there is a greater chance of ADHD, children with ADHD having difficulties with anxiety, but it's not a foregone conclusion necessarily. The signs and symptoms of anxiety are probably quite well known, but we'll just take another look at them. And if you just take a moment now to think about how you experience anxiety, because we all experience in fairly different ways, really, although there's consistencies across human beings in general. So how do you experience anxiety? We can divide it into several groups, really. So thoughts, what you may notice in your children are certain thought patterns which are more anxious. So children may be very open, they may talk about their worries, and if they're able to do that, that's wonderful. With younger children, you might notice them recreating worries or certain stories in their play, and things that they're acting out with their toys. You might notice a change in mood. So you might notice that your child becomes more sad, more tearful, or more withdrawn. You also might notice, and this is perhaps one of the most common signs, change in behaviour. So as you perhaps have experienced yourselves, when you are worried or anxious or stressed, you might become more irritable. And it's the same for children as well. So you might see more angry, argumentative kind of behaviour, or getting in fights with parents or siblings. You might find more demanding behaviour, so more attention seeking, perhaps constant reassurance seeking, or clingy behaviour. And you might also see a child losing confidence, and they might be avoiding things like doing schoolwork, maybe avoiding video contact with friends or family. They may not want to go out for walks. And again, these can't be totally attributable to anxiety. So for example, particularly with schoolwork, it might be more of a motivational issue, but it could also be explained by an increase in anxiety. And then lastly, there are those very common physical signs of anxiety. So there's the heart rate, and those are kind of seen in moments of tenser anxiety. But over a longer period, you might see changes in sleep patterns, particularly falling asleep, although again, this can be a common feature of ADHD anyway. But if you notice further changes to that, difficulties falling asleep, it could be anxiety related. You might notice changes to appetite, and some children and adults get physical health complaints, which is anxiety manifesting as physical difficulties. So some common ones are headaches and stomach aches. So if you get children frequently complaining of those things and there isn't or doesn't seem to be a medical cause, it could well be anxiety. So with all that large variety of different signs and symptoms, how on earth can you possibly tell it's anxiety compared to perhaps a motivational issue, just behaviour? Well, the answer to that is quite tricky, but there are certain things that you can do to try and tease out for a child or young person what's going on for them. And that's important to do because then you can obviously try and put things in place to help them. So if you are noticing any of those challenges or particular changes in behaviour or exacerbations in certain behaviour, it's worth having a think about it and a bit of an explore with young people. So obviously the first thing you can do is to ask a child or young person if they are worried about anything. And the best way to do this is using open-ended questions rather than questions that you get a yes no answer from. So for example, what kind of worries do you have at the moment? Now that would obviously be the really simple solution, but unfortunately life's not always like that. So we have to be really aware that the child may not even be aware that they're feeling anxious, and they might not want to share it with you either. And that's really common that they might not be aware. If you think about it, adults often aren't aware that they're feeling anxious. So it's a really tricky feeling to be aware of, and children are still in the process of learning. But in terms of wanting to share, there can be quite a bit of shame surrounding feelings like anxiety, but often children want to protect their parents from their worries as well. So another way of kind of gently exploring with children is to be curious with them and wonder aloud with your child or young person. So for example, you can say to them, I wonder whether you're feeling worried about not seeing your friends, for example, and it's making you not want to meet up with them on a video link, or I wonder whether you're feeling worried about the situation and it's affecting how you are with your brother. So you're just being curious and wondering aloud, and they might just kind of snap back at you or tell you that that's not what it is at all, and it might not be, but what you are doing is kind of trying to show some understanding and open a dialogue with them about how they might be feeling, and sowing a seed, really. And finally, it's really important to try and get a dialogue going to normalise worry, particularly in a time like this, but in any circumstance really. Worry is very normal, and normalising it and talking about how other people might be feeling worried is a really good way to open up that dialogue, and also try and reduce stigma around it. So using some of those techniques, you can try and explore and tease out whether it is anxiety if you're not in a situation where your child is openly disclosing it. The other thing you can do is notice when the behaviour might be happening. And to do this, you can use something that is called an antecedent behaviour consequence chart, an ABC chart, which it basically means what happened before the behaviour and what happened after the behaviour. And this can often help to decipher whether it's a behaviour specific to a certain circumstance, or whether it's kind of more of a generalised behavioural challenge. So for example, you might notice that a child shows a certain behaviour when you suggest to go out for a walk. And it might be that they're somehow feeling anxious about going out for a walk. It might be that they show the behaviour when you ask them to do their home schoolwork. And that's a trickier one, because it might be because they're not motivated, as I was saying earlier, or it might kind of allude to a certain anxiety. But getting patterns of behaviour and what the behaviour is can be a really helpful kind of pointer for what the triggers might be. And then it gives you the opportunity to explore with them a bit more about what might be happening.
Gemma, sorry, Tamsin, can I just interrupt you?
Yes.
There's a error message on the screen saying you're sharing your screen. I don't know if you can minimize it maybe, or just close the box.
Thank you.
Sorry about that.
That should be gone now. Is that okay?
Yes, much better. Thanks.
Sorry. Okay, so I also wanted to mention to you about anxious thoughts and the vicious cycle of anxiety, and this we'll come to this a little bit later on, because it can be an important part of supporting particularly young people with managing anxieties and anxious thoughts. And this comes from a particular model which many of you, I'm sure, have heard of, called cognitive behaviour therapy. And it's the idea that our thoughts affect our feelings, and that affects our bodily symptoms, and then that affects our actions or behaviour. So according to cognitive behaviour therapy, there will always be a thought that comes before any feeling. And it kind of makes sense. If we're having happy thoughts, we're more likely to feel happy. If we're feeling worried thoughts, we're going to feel worried. So a common thought for young people, or children particularly, will be a fear of the dark. And they might have a thought that someone's going to get me, there's a monster under my bed, I'm not safe. And that will, of course, lead them to feel scared and anxious. They might get a heart rate increase. They might become sweaty or shaky. And then the behaviour would be to leave the light on, or to make sure a parent was there when they're falling asleep. And then what that behaviour does is it just serves to reinforce the thought, and it doesn't allow them to prove that they're not in danger and that someone isn't going to get them. Now, sometimes these thoughts like this can be based in reality and past experiences. Often, though, they're more the kind of irrational thoughts that I was referring to earlier. And this is a really good one to look out for, in children and young people to see if you can tune in and notice any kind of, we call them negative thoughts that they might be having, any particular worry thoughts that they might be vocalizing and coming up with. And as I said, I'll talk a bit more later about how you can sort of start to gently challenge some of those thoughts. Okay. So this is the big question really. What can parents do to help their children and young people with anxiety? I want to say that there's not a magic fix solution here, and you know, when we're learning these techniques, it's kind of best to do it when you're at your calmest, really. And this perhaps isn't a period when we are at our calmest. However, that it's always a good time to kind of start with some of these strategies, and the goal would be to sort of begin an education for children in how to manage these feelings, which is a lifetime's work for many people, and many adults haven't quite learned how to do it. I think that's the difference with the time that we're living in now, is that there's a lot more recognition about these feelings and strategies for managing them. So you're probably doing a lot of these things already, and sometimes it's worth it's useful, A, to know that you might be doing the right thing already, but B, that to remind yourself of what strategies there are so you can start to kind of implement them a bit more. So I'm going to start by talking about COVID-specific anxiety. But when I say COVID-specific anxiety, I'm talking about anxiety about the coronavirus, but also just anxiety about being in this really strange situation, this very different situation. And so one of the key things you can do, sorry, just to go back a moment, it's going to increase everybody's stress, this situation. And we know that stress leads to anxiety. So if there's anything that we can do to reduce stress, that is going to help with anxiety. So the first thing that we can do is try and put some sort of structure in the day. Now, this is a tough one, I do understand, because you might be parenting on your own, you might be working, you might have several other children to manage. So I'm talking about a very loose structure here. It can be as simple as getting dressed in the morning, doing play or some work in the morning, coming together for lunch, doing something outside in the afternoon, having dinner, going to bed. You know, it doesn't have to be a really structured timetable, because that's almost setting yourself up to fail in a way. And it can be fluid and it can be flexible. And obviously some children respond much better to structure anyway, particularly if you have a child who might have autism. And there's a loss of structure that is there at school. So you know your child best, maybe you do need something a bit tighter and more rigid. But a general loose structure can be a really helpful way of reducing stress and managing anxiety. The next thing to consider is sleep. An awful lot of children and young people during this time are having affected sleep for a number of reasons, whether it's stress or anxiety, whether it's because they're not getting enough exercise in the day, they're not getting the kind of exhilaration of school, for want of a better word, that it's kind of a lower level of stimulation that most people are getting in the day, and that's affecting sleep. However, a lack of sleep will lead to more stress and anxiety. So there's not too much you can do other than trying to encourage exercise if you can, encourage them to get out and get vitamin D if you can. It's harder if you don't have a garden, but again it's going back to that idea of structure and routine. So you might now have a later bedtime, but trying to stick to that bedtime and have good sleep hygiene in place. So screen time not too close to bedtime, calming activities, and all that can kind of fall out the window a bit at times like this. So it might be useful to, if that has happened, to reintroduce that if anxiety is an issue. We all know that exercise has been scientifically proven to help with anxiety. So if there is a way of getting more exercise into a child or young person's day, then that could help. And lastly, I've mentioned something called PACE. Now, this isn't a anxiety management tool as such. It's more of a model, a relational model, which can be really useful for parents, and it's a way of helping children to feel more understood, which can then have an impact on them being more open to listen to you as parents, whether that be in terms of the behavioural management techniques you want to put in place, or supporting them with something like anxiety. And PACE stands for, it's just to say who developed it, it's somebody called Dan Hughes, who's very big in the attachment world. And it stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. It starts with curiosity, and we've talked a bit about that already. It's about being curious about why a child is acting in a way they're acting, whether that's in an anxious way, a sad way, a challenging way. So showing curiosity by just wondering out loud why they might be acting in that way. The next stage is acceptance. Now, acceptance isn't necessarily acceptance of a behaviour as in condoning the behaviour, it's accepting the feeling that's led to it. So I understand that you're acting in this way because you're worried or because you're cross. Then comes empathy, so empathising with them. That's really hard to feel like that. I'm sorry you feel like that. And then, if you can, to playfulness and humour is always good to add into the kind of dialogue as well, although not always easy to do. I understand when the child is being challenging. But if you kind of take this stance initially with the child, particularly if they're feeling anxious, it can really help them to feel supported and open up, and particularly when it's in relation to coronavirus specific difficulties, because you're allowing those feelings. I think it's really important with a child who has anxieties to allow those feelings. I think it's very common for us to want to make it better really quickly, but an important first step is to kind of acknowledge the feelings are there, empathise and accept them. Now, the next thing is a challenging one, and that's about being aware of your own anxieties in relation to this situation, because they're likely to have a knock-on effect on your child, and that's not to put any pressure on us as parents necessarily, because of course we're going to have anxieties as well. There are people out there losing their jobs, losing homes. There's all sorts of really difficult things happening which will make people anxious, and we can't stop that. However, it's useful just to be aware of how you're managing that, and how you're expressing those in front of your children. And it's worth thinking about, if you are having difficulties, whether there's any support that you might need to get, whether that's via talking to a friend more, or using Richmond Wellbeing, because it's a challenging time for everybody, and it's that age-old analogy of putting the oxygen mask on you before your child on an aeroplane. You have to make sure that you're looking after yourself first, so that you can look after your children. The next thing that you can do, and again I've mentioned this before, is normalise the feelings, particularly if they're kind of coronavirus specific. We don't want to kind of shove down the feelings and say, oh, it's okay, there's nothing to worry about, because children pick up on things and they know what's going on a little bit. It's very confusing, but to just say, to normalise the feelings and say, yes, I understand you're feeling that way. A lot of people are feeling like that at the moment. And then you can go on to use the strategies that we'll talk about soon. But really it's about kind of having a very empathic and understanding approach, which kind of helps children to feel at ease talking to you about these anxieties, which is such a big first step really, because talking about the worries can help alleviate them, or go a long way to helping to alleviate them. I've also put down here that if a child is having anxieties about the coronavirus specifically, about catching the virus, for example, there are a couple of really good resources out there. You may well have heard about these already, because so much is going around at the moment. But for the 5 to 9 year olds, there's the book by illustrator of the Julia Donaldson books, specifically about coronavirus. And then there's more recently this one that's come out called Bombini the Bee, and that's for slightly older children, I'd say, maybe kind of 7 or 8 plus. And that's a bit more of a serious book about the coronavirus. It's a really, really lovely book, and I would recommend that if you've got real kind of difficulties within a family, so real concerns about a family member with a health problem, for example. Otherwise it might be a bit heavy going, but you can check them out anyway and see what you think. The next thing to do is reassurance. Now, normally we wouldn't recommend excessive reassurance seeking. However, in the current situation, we're in a bit of a different climate, aren't we? And you can reassure your child and begin to help support them with coping thoughts. So thoughts like, this won't last forever, and chances are we are going to be safe. You can also start to help them think about different strategies. So when you feel this way, what can we do to help you? And we'll talk about those strategies in a moment. Another really important thing to do, I think, in this situation is think about what a child values. So what's important to them in their life. And I think we should do this as well. So, is it your friends? Is it spending time with your family? What values has this particular situation affected? So a common one is, if you value your friendships, you're not able to spend as much time with your friends. And then thinking, is there any way you can move closer to those values, even in this current situation? So for example, can you send something to a friend, FaceTime them, or plan what you'll do when you see them again? Because often when our values are taken away from us, it can make us feel anxious, and it can decrease our mood, and obviously a situation like this is going to remove us from those. So it's really useful. I think this is particularly good for older children, but for younger children too, they might be able to start thinking about what's important to them. So I'm going to hand you back over to Gemma now to think about some strategies for older children.
So it's important for our older children to encourage them to think about their well-being and find different activities that they can do to occupy themselves in this time. And we know that if you split your time into things like doing different things, so some things that fill you with pleasure, that are quite enjoyable, maybe things like watching a film, things where you can achieve. So these can be really small things, and it can be anything from them doing some schoolwork, or it can be doing some housework, maybe cleaning their bedroom, even just a very small thing, washing the pots up after dinner. That can really help our mood as well. And then staying connected is the last area, which is made a lot easier now with technology. Like, we have all this video calling, lots of young people have group chats and things like that as well. So it's important to find a balance between those things. And some things you can do are to keep yourself occupied or listening to music, trying to get outside. Now that the measures have been reduced a bit, you can get outside a little bit more. If you have a garden, do some gardening, read a book and watch a film. And some other strategies you can put in place for young people, but also for yourselves, is to challenge any thoughts you're having compassionately. So be considerate of the situation we're in, and know that it is normal to be feeling a bit more anxious at the moment, and be mindful about what you can do in the present moment to relieve your anxiety and what you actually have control over. Notice and limit your worries. So try to identify what triggers your anxiety. Is it being on social media too often and seeing all these scary stories coming up? And along a similar line, if you are going to be keeping up to date with the news, make sure that it's a reliable source, because there's lots of different things going around. So just make sure that you're paying attention to where you're getting your news from. Setting a routine is helpful, as Tamsin had earlier said. Having some sort of schedule is really helpful, but again, it can be loose. It doesn't have to be a strict routine by any means. It's just helpful to have some regular activities taking place. And then when you're planning your activities for the day, try to do things that are keeping both your body and your mind active. And then practice gratitude and focus. So it's really helpful at the end of the day to reflect on things that you're thankful for, or something that's gone well that day. This is good for reducing your anxiety, but also it can be really helpful to improve sleep, which we know will also have a knock-on effect. So that's really helpful as well.
Okay. So moving on now to think about some general anxiety management techniques. These are things that can be used for, at the beginning I was saying that you know there might be more lockdown specific anxieties, or there might just be a situation where your child is more anxious, and these strategies can be used in both situations. And as I was saying earlier, actually these strategies are best practiced when you're feeling calm. However, you know, you can practice them in this situation and start to get the ball rolling if you don't already use them. And you can use them in an anxious moment to feel calm, but you can also practice them on a regular basis to give you almost like a calmer baseline. So if you use these almost preventatively in a way, then they can help you to feel generally calmer overall. These techniques aren't rocket science, they're very common, you've probably heard about them already, but let me take you through them now. So grounding techniques, now these are quite similar to mindfulness, and you've probably heard about mindfulness. They're called grounding techniques because they're thought to ground you in the present moment. And the challenge with anxiety is that your mind is taken off to anxious places and anxious thoughts. Equally, your mind can get taken to some very physical unpleasant sensations, and you really focus on those things. Well, grounding techniques, the idea is that they almost distract you from those horrible situations, but they help you to feel present in the moment. There's all sorts of different grounding techniques you can use. A popular one with the children and young people is the 5 senses game, which is where you name 5 things that you can hear, see, smell, etc., etc. And you can do this anywhere. You might not be able to draw on all the senses. So for example, if you're out for a walk, you can do it while you're walking. And it's good to kind of practice these things, and you know, younger children might want to do it with you, older children might not. Another grounding technique is a body scan exercise, where you're thinking about the different parts of your body and noticing what you feel in them, and that's a very common mindfulness exercise, and there are loads of apps out there to support you with this. I'm sure many of you have heard of Headspace, lots of free resources that you can use. And you know, a lot of children and young people tell me they hate body scan. A lot of children really like it. So you kind of have to try out these different things, and don't be disappointed if your child or young person hates them. There will be something out there which does help with their anxiety, and it's really about trial and error. It's very similar with breathing exercises. They're a bit like Marmite too. Some young people hate them and some will love them. And it often feels like a bit of a cliche, doesn't it, when you say to someone, take some deep breaths. But we do know that breathing in a particular way can physiologically calm the body down. And sometimes I find it's useful to tell young people that, because it's a bit of proof and a bit of evidence that it's not just an old cliche. There's very different ways that you can breathe. I think for young people it can be useful to have more of a concrete tool for it. So this is where the 5-finger breathing is really nice, where you breathe in through your nose as you trace your one side of the finger, and breathe out through your mouth as you trace down the other side of the finger. So you're tracing your fingers as you breathe in and out, and it just gives a physical kind of cue for a child. And I think that's particularly good, I've found, with children with ADHD as well, because it gives something to do with the hands. A really simple one, but this is one I particularly like, is breathing in for the count of 5 and out for the count of 6. What the goal really is to breathe out for slightly longer than you breathe in, because that's what physiologically calms the body down. There are more physical things you can do to manage anxiety, which I find are often much more popular with children. The other things can be popular too, but these a lot of children can get more on board with. And we know that that kind of exercise can give the body something else to do and can help to calm it down, and it has a longer term effect on anxiety as well. But in the moment, if somebody's kind of in an anxious space, you can get them to run around the garden if you have one, do 50 jumping jacks, or do a kind of lower level physical activity such as yoga. And again, there's lots of free yoga resources out there like Cosmic Kids. And then lastly, you may have heard of something called progressive muscle relaxation. And again, this is something which is very useful strategy for calming you down. And what that involves is going through all the different muscle groups in your body and squeezing them for a few seconds and then relaxing them again. And again, there's lots of apps out there and YouTube videos which will support you through that. For young children, you can make it more fun by, for example, pretending that they're squeezing a lemon really tightly and then letting it go again. Or sometimes we'll get children to pretend that they're standing really stiff, like an uncooked piece of spaghetti, and then they flop down and they're a cooked piece of spaghetti. So you can make it a bit more interesting, and you can do these things together as a family to try and encourage them to try them out. And as I was saying, these are things you can do in the moment to relieve heightened anxiety, but I would really suggest trying to build them into day-to-day life, really, to give a kind of calmer baseline overall, but also so the strategies are more accessible in the moment too. For children who have generally heightened levels of anxiety, I think it's always really useful to develop a calm box with them, which you can create together. And as I was saying, all children are going to be different in terms of what they find useful for their calming down strategies, just like adults are all different in terms of what they find useful. So whatever it is that they find calms them down, you can put it in a box, write it on a bit of paper, almost like a bit of a kind of menu for things they can do and go to when they are feeling worried. And as a parent, you may well have noticed what helps them to feel calm. Again, this is where the ABC charts can be useful, because you can kind of just have a little look at your child over the course of the day and notice when they're at their calmest. You might already be able to tell without doing that. So there's various different ideas of short, quick things they can do to help them feel calm in the moment. And it's good to do it together so that they're more on board with it. I talked earlier about thought-based strategies because we think that anxiety is very driven by anxious thoughts, which can often be irrational. With younger children and also with adolescents, I think a really good place to start, and an easier place to start, is with some very simple coping thoughts that they can come up with to try and gently challenge some of the more negative thoughts that they might be having. So for example, if they have anxieties about not being able to do their schoolwork, they could say, I can do this, or I'm just going to try my best. What's the worst that can happen if I get it wrong? Just thoughts, coping thoughts and questions like that, which can support anxiety. It's quite a tricky thing to do, I think. And even as adults, you know, we get these negative thoughts, and it's hard to challenge them. And I think if your child is really, really struggling with anxiety, sometimes it can be useful to get them referred for some support, so that somebody can kind of help them and coach them with some of these strategies. There's a couple of useful books at the end which I'll recommend, which parents can use to, if you think that your child has particularly severe anxiety, it's a good way that parents can help to coach their children through some of these thoughts. Building self-esteem can be really helpful for anxious children as well. So having more of a focus on the positives. I think when children are anxious, self-esteem and confidence can really be affected, and shifting back to a more positive way of viewing yourself can be really helpful in kind of quashing the anxiety a bit. So this is a really challenging one. I think particularly within the society that we live in, there's a kind of culture of modesty and not wanting to boast too much. So children often need a bit of help and support to notice their positives. Sometimes parents also need a bit of help and support to notice their child's positives in challenging situations, but you kind of have to tease out what some of their good qualities are. And then a really helpful thing to do can be to notice them throughout the day. what the goal would be for your child to start to notice those things as well, and just to try and build and foster that self-esteem. I put a worry tree here. I don't know if anyone's heard of a worry tree before, but this can be a really, really good tool for adolescents and also kind of older primary school children, and just gives a really nice structured way of dealing with very specific worries. So this is good if you have a worry and you know that you're worried about a particular thing, and it takes you through a flow chart almost of noticing the worry. You ask yourself, can I do anything about this? Because often you can't. And then if the answer is no, you try and let the worry go by either distracting yourself or using some of your other tools that you have. If you can do something about it, make a plan. What will it be, etc., etc. And it can just be a really useful way of thinking through worries, and supporting you with it, because sometimes our brains can get into a bit of a fog when we have anxieties. So this can be a useful thing to have in children's rooms. Now, I've been talking about all these strategies, and I do wonder whether anyone's been thinking, how on earth am I going to get my child to actually do any of these things? It might be that you have a child who's very open to trying these things. I'm sure many children aren't, particularly when a parent suggesting it. It can be met with a lot of reluctance. And there are some different ways to try and encourage your child to use them. One way is whether you can incorporate it into their learning or their homeschooling. I noticed that a lot of schools are kind of sending home more emotional related curriculum learning at the moment, and many schools, if you're a Richmond based school, they're sending out links to their Trailblazers kind of emotional support resources for families, so you could tap into those. Another thing you can do if learning itself is a challenge, and trying to motivate that as a challenge, you can use rewards for getting them to practice these strategies. They don't have to be monetary rewards, but they can be kind of extra time on the iPad, or staying up and watching TV a bit later at the weekend, for example, whatever it is you think might be appropriate. But if you notice that your child is experiencing anxieties and they're reluctant to try these strategies, it can be really helpful to say, well, look, let's give it a go. And I know it's hard to do that and to try these new things, but if you show that you're giving them a good go, maybe we can have a reward for it. Ultimately, the reward would hopefully be noticing that their anxiety had reduced. But in the meantime, you might need a bit more motivation than that. The other thing you can do is do it as a whole family together. So rather than just kind of saying to your child, oh, why don't you try this, do it all together. So for example, as I was saying, if you're having a walk, do the grounding technique, the 5 senses game. Or, for example, another good game to play, which is a useful distraction game, is the ABC game, where you name something from each letter of the alphabet, like a country beginning with A, B, C, or a food beginning with A, B, C, etc., etc. So doing these kind of games and distraction or grounding techniques together as a family. A really important thing to say is to be very realistic here. So I've talked to you about all these different things, and you might be able to get your child to do one, you might not be able to get your child to do any of them at all. The only thing you might be able to do is notice your child's worry and show curiosity about it and normalize it. So you might be doing all the kind of strategies yourself, and they might not be doing anything at all, but those things in themselves are going to be useful as foundations and building blocks for starting to work with anxiety. Because as I was saying, learning anxiety management strategies can be a lifetime's work, and I think this is a particularly challenging time to start learning anything, really. However, if we start to sow the seeds, this can be enough, and kind of recognise that you're still going to be going some way to helping them, because there isn't a magic wand here necessarily. Just a word there on onward referrals. If you feel like your child is suffering from anxiety and might need some extra support for it. There's a couple of resources at the moment. Obviously there's the emotional health service where Gemma and I work, and you can self-refer to that, or schools can refer to our service. There's also Cooth, which is an online counselling service, which children in the borough can access at the moment for free. And as I was mentioning at the beginning, I wanted to say a final word on supporting yourself during this time, because if we can do anything to reduce our own stress, then that's going to be really important and have a knock-on impact on our children. So the first really important thing is to lower expectations of yourself. There's a lot of people at the moment having quite high expectations of how they should be coping, but actually surviving and meeting your children's physical needs and some of their emotional needs is fine at the moment. Use a very critical eye when you're looking at social media. So for example, if there are people on a school WhatsApp group, for example, posting pictures of their children's wonderful work, use a critical eye, because for everybody that's doing that, there'll be another person who's struggling, and there'll be times when that person's struggling too. So just take the pressure off yourself. And there'll be some days when you can do that brilliantly, and there'll be others when you can't. There'll be times when it's up and down. The other thing is to lower expectations of your child as well. Just like us, our children are having to cope with a very strange time, and it's likely that there's going to be changes in their behaviour and their mood. That's not to say you should condone difficult behaviour, but it's about, and again, I think this is where the PACE model can be really useful. It's about just kind of putting management systems in place, but with a kind of very empathic, framework. I've put "is self-care possible" in there. People always talk about self-care, and actually I was reading an interesting article by Sarah Ockwell-Smith, who's a very famous kind of parenting psychologist, and she said, "Is self-care even possible at the moment?" I'm not going to tell people to self-care, because we're just kind of surviving and getting through. But I think self-care can even be very basic things like, are you making sure you're drinking and eating throughout the day? Because our standards can really slip at a time like this. So if there is scope for a teensy bit of self-care, even if it's just watching half an hour of TV on your own before you go to bed, or just making sure that you're getting enough water throughout the day, or eating enough, just making sure that you're looking after yourself as much as you can. And as Gemma was saying earlier, reflection at the end of the day on what went well can be really useful, because sometimes if we've had a really, really tough day, that's what looms large in our minds. But there's bound to have been one, maybe two small things that we can reflect on which did go well and which we can feel pleased of. And it's nice to kind of remember those things at the end of the day, and to try not to let the difficult things dominate too much. And then lastly, it can be important to find a way of offloading your feelings, just to kind of vent, really. And that might be to a friend, it might be that you feel like you need more formal support, whatever it might be, from time to time, to be able to offload your feelings can be useful. And as I mentioned already, that we're all unique and every child is unique. So you will be more likely and best placed to know what might work best for your child. The child might have some idea as well, but it's kind of work in progress. And I would always suggest trying out different things. It's like trying on different clothes to see which one fits best for you. And once you've found something, that's great. Practice it and use it as much as you can. And it's good to have a few different things up your sleeve as well. So a variety of different things you can draw on. I've recommended some apps here for you. Stop, Breathe, Think is a free app with some good kind of breathing exercises and relaxation exercises. Calm is a lovely app, but you have to pay for that one, but that's got all sorts of kind of body scans and some lovely sleep related stories, but also music. Likewise, Headspace, you can get, I think, 10 free mindfulness sessions on there. But a really great app that's recently come out is Think Ninja. particularly for adolescents, and that's more cognitive behavioural based, and it can help your young person to develop some of the more thought-based strategies to support them with any negative, anxious thoughts they might be having. And then there's a poster here called 50 Ways to Take a Break, which is some different things that you can draw on which might help relieve anxiety, increase mood and lower stress. Again, because we're all a bit different, and what works for one person might not work for another. So it just gives some more ideas there. And then lastly, some reading here. Don't want to overwhelm you too much with too many different things. There's a couple of books here for children and young people, What to Do When You Worry Too Much, and A Huge Bag of Worries, which can come up with some nice little strategies that they can use. And again, those are good if you do have a child who is a worrier, who would be receptive to sitting down and reading that kind of thing. They have to be, really. If they're not, then Overcoming Your Child's Fears and Worries is a really useful self-help guide for parents. And again, research has shown that it's based on cognitive behaviour therapy, that this kind of approach, just used by parents, can be helpful on its own when trying to help support children with anxiety. In fact, our service now runs anxiety management groups just for parents as well as for children, but because it's proven to be a really effective way, and that parents can be very useful kind of therapists in supporting their children with anxiety. And then lastly, I put the Relax Kids website. So that's got some fantastic resources for helping children to cope with all sorts of different stressful situations. So thank you for listening. Does anybody have any thoughts or questions? Yes, I'm not sure if any questions have come up on the chat. Oh, there's a couple there, so shall I have a look?
No, these were just with some of the logistics, so not very many questions. But maybe I can kick off with one. And one of the things you were talking about was sort of offloading your feelings. So when parents are feeling anxious and so on, is it best to, actually it sounds as though somebody's got their microphone on. I'm going to just mute all. Sorry about that. So when parents are really anxious, you said it's sometimes good to offload, their concerns and their anxieties. Would you say it's best to sort of not share that with your child? Or is sometimes sharing with your child that you're also anxious ties in with the empathy? And how do parents strike that balance?
Yes, it's such a good question, and that's a really good way of putting it. How do you strike that balance? Because I talked a bit about normalizing, didn't I? And I think it's important to acknowledge that people feel worried at a time like this. We don't want to pretend that no one else is anxious, but I think it's about using it as an opportunity to normalize feelings. So, for example, I'm feeling a bit worried about, I don't know, whatever it might be, and then using it as an opportunity to model coping, if you see what I mean. So almost using it as a kind of opportunity to show how you might cope with that particular worry. I think what we have to be quite careful of as parents is if we've got really big worries that perhaps a child shouldn't be party to. So for example, if there are money worries and again, it's really difficult, especially when we're living in close proximity to our children. There is going to be a bit of overspill, isn't there? But I suppose it's the excessive worry. So if you're kind of find that you're verbalizing about your worries a lot throughout the day, then I think that would be an indicator that maybe it would be helpful to have someone to offload to. But it is a difficult balance to strike, and you kind of don't want to make people feel guilty for talking about their worries, because it's natural and it's normal, and you want to normalize worry to children. But I think it's useful to use it as an opportunity to show children how you might cope with feelings, and to take the shame away from it as well. It's fine to feel worried and stressed about things.
Yeah.
I don't know if that really answers. I don't think there's a really ideal answer to that, because everyone's situations are so different. I think what can be really nice is if, let's say for example, you've feel stressed one day and you've been really irritable and grumpy all day, for example, which perhaps could be quite a common situation for people at the moment. At the end of the day, to acknowledge to a child, I was quite grumpy today, and I'm sorry, I'm just feeling a bit stressed about my work today, and I'm sorry about that. And those kind of conversations are quite healthy and natural and supportive, I think, to be having in families.
Yeah, I think actually your comment about it being proportionate, because you don't want children worrying about money, things that they can't control. I understand that. Great, we've got another question here from Anita, and it's about anxiety and self-esteem being linked. And she said, my daughter does not believe she is as good as others. There's a real fear of failure, and this prevents her from doing things.
Yeah, they're definitely linked, because you feel, I mean, it's an anxiety, isn't it, I suppose, feeling that you're not as good as other people, and then that avoidance comes into it, doesn't it, because you're worried about failing, so it stops you from doing things, and you can see that kind of vicious cycle happening there. And then she doesn't get to prove to herself, I guess, that she might not fail when she does things. So I guess in those situations it's really good to have noticed that is where some of the anxiety is tied up, because then you can do something about it. And it's a tough one, but I think it's a slow process of starting to try and get the child to notice their strengths. And usually, as I was saying, you have to start by doing that as the parent, and kind of, you wouldn't normally have to do it in this sort of directive way, but often if I'm working with a child who's got self-esteem difficulties, we'll get them to come up with their parent about what their positive qualities are, and then write them on the fridge, and then get them to notice every time they show that quality throughout the day. And usually it starts with the parents having to notice it, and then the goal would be the child getting to notice it, so that you're kind of building up self-esteem. Because the thing about anxiety and low self-esteem is that you're drawn to the negative things that you've done, and you're not noticing the positive things. So it's a bit like you've got a negative jar in your head and a positive jar in your head, and you fill up the negative jar with all the difficult experiences you've had, but you ignore the positive things. So you kind of have to make, for children who do have that difficulty, you have to make more of an effort than you might have done for another child to fill up the positive jar. Does that make sense?
Anita, do you want to, maybe we'll move on to the next question. I mean, I do think that that's very helpful in terms of building the positive. And actually, sometimes it's something totally unrelated. So if they can't tie their shoes, it's perhaps talking to them that they're kind and they're very considerate when the cat is, crying or hungry. So it's sometimes going so totally in a different direction, isn't it, to encourage them to be positive.
Yes, yeah. Just noticing some other questions. There's one at the top there about, can anxiety be displayed as aggression towards you, and how would you suggest you approach that? Yeah, it's a good question. It can be, definitely. It goes back to that earlier tricky question about, is it anxiety? I think with aggression, it often is a stress related situation, and again that can be driven by anxiety, but it's totally different from child to child. It might be something completely different. That's where I think the ABC chart can be quite useful, because there can be so many factors that come into it. For example, if it's a child with autism, are they being aggressive towards you because they're upset about a change to their environment? What is it that kind of prompts the aggressive outburst, if you see what I mean? And then can you do something to change that situation? So that would be my first kind of piece of advice, a kind of ABC, and getting to grips with, is there anything that you can do to prevent it in the first place? But then failing that, or if that doesn't completely change the situation, what I would suggest is trying to work quite proactively on it. So it might be an issue of kind of going from 0 to 60 in terms of angry behaviour and a sort of inhibition, impulsivity difficulty, in which case you kind of need to acknowledge that there's a difficulty with them. I'm not sure how old the child is, but do a kind of reward-based approach to getting them to try and manage it in a different way. So they would get rewards for maybe going to a calm box and taking out something that would help them to feel calm. But it's a really tough one, and it'll take quite a while to kind of help a difficulty like that. And it needs to be done with quite a sort of supportive, understanding rather than punitive way. And often the children are kind of lashing out at you as a parent because they feel safe to do that. And it might be that you need help with that, because that sounds like a really challenging difficulty to experience. And I guess that's where services like the EHS can come in.
We've got an interesting question from Alison, who said that her child refuses to accept that they're feeling that there might be anxiety.
Yeah.
She says he's got all this physical symptoms, low energy, stomach aches, etc.
Yeah.
But he's adamant he's not anxious. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder how old the child is. Does it say? Don't know whether you can quickly answer, Alison, on the 8 years old. Yeah. So I think that is a really, really difficult one. Poor thing. It's really tough, isn't it? So I think what I would do in this sort of situation is try and respond to the behaviour. I wonder whether this is another one again where some external support might be helpful, because it sounds like you've kind of, oh, I can see you now, Alison.
Yes, sure, there's a button. Yes, this is kind of a long-running thing. This child actually has autism. It's his brother who has ADHD. But I just thought, as we were talking about anxiety, it would be helpful, because we just end up in this complete impasse when I try and suggest it's anxiety. He says, no, I'm not ill, and I'm therefore being very, very mean by trying to encourage him to take part in activities, or, you know, and there's a lot of anxiety around the homeschooling and doing schoolwork.
Yeah.
Ended up having to abandon it when I was trying to gently ease back. But he just says I'm not believing him, and therefore I'm being mean when I try and suggest his stomach ache. You know, and I do try and make the distinction. I don't believe you don't have stomach ache, but I think the cause of it is something different, and therefore we need to think about it differently. But it's not really landing terribly well.
Yeah, and that's really difficult, isn't it? I think that's a perfect way of dealing with it, is saying, you know, you're not saying that you don't have a tummy ache. I think as an 8-year-old, it's quite hard to take on board the idea that he's really feeling this physical sensation and perhaps doesn't really know what anxiety is. So in a way, it might be best just to drop the kind of talk about anxiety for now and kind of revisit it when he's a bit older, but to acknowledge that he's got a tummy ache. And then I would try and kind of, because he's got autism, to see if there's any kind of just changes that you can put in place to support with that anxiety from an environmental point of view. There's loads of really good, actually I should forward it to Annette. I don't know, there's loads of really amazing things out there to support anxiety in children with autism in this particular time, which might be useful to draw on.
Okay, sorry, I realised I've hijacked an ADHD talk to talk about this.
No, but it's such a common thing that can happen anyway. But I suppose what I would, again, it's because it sounds like a long-standing issue, I would try and notice exceptions. So noticing times when he doesn't have a tummy ache. And then kind of trying to build up on those moments a bit more. Are there times like that?
Yes, there are. Yes, and he will often get a bit caught out, you know, when he's playing on the Xbox, he'll be well into it.
Yeah.
And I'll say, "Oh, Lawrence, you seem better. How are you feeling now?" And then he realizes that he's supposed to be all washed out and ill. And yes, I probably need to try responding to it in a bit more of a positive way and set aside my frustration that he seems to be a bit selective about when he feels ill and when he doesn't.
But and as well for him, because it's really common when people do get a kind of illness as a result of anxiety, there's a real hyper focus on those symptoms, so anything that you can do to distract his attention away from those things, and obviously so what we often recommend in these situations, don't ask how they're feling. Just kind of try and, if he mentions it, you can empathise with him, of course, and say, "Oh, that's really tricky, poor thing." But I would almost kind of, it sounds like, because for some children they will be able to take on board, "Oh, it's anxiety," but it sounds like that's not really working, and maybe it'd be best just to kind of try and distract and know that there are going to be moments when he does feel like this, but you could sort of try and limit it. So if he feels like he needs to relax and watch TV, so okay, you can, but let's make it sort of shorter and shorter periods, for example. But that's a really tough one. I think maybe some support for that might be.
Yes. I the emotional health services we mentioned. I wasn't sure what they were doing in the current situation and whether they were taking referrals.
Yes, we are.
Okay, right.
And are you? Maybe you could just tell us a bit about your service, Tamsin. Are you? What happens? Somebody goes for a self-referral, and then do you get in contact with them and have a Zoom call or something like that?
Yes. So at the moment, we take referrals. There's a single point of access which decide whether it comes to us or Tier 3 CAMS. We then have an assessment with the family. At the moment, it's via video, and then we decide with the family what would be appropriate. If it's our service, it's either family therapy, art therapy, or CBT, or EMDR we offer, which is more trauma-based work. And then they go on another waiting list for that particular therapy. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
That's a really great, not to lose time, I think that's great to move forward and actually get into the system, because if your child has got this anxiety, it may be heightened now, but at least you want to get the help. We've got a great question here from Linda, who said she's got an 8-year-old daughter, and she's very happy to be home with lockdown, but she's had a fear of darkness, and it's gone through the roof with lockdown. And so she really wants to know whether she should just let her be, or try and continue to progress the...
Sorry, you've frozen a bit, Annette. I'm just going to try and find the question.
It's from Linda Campbell Arthur.
Okay, I can see that now. So you had made some progress before lockdown. It sounds like, which is brilliant. My gut feeling is that it's gone through the roof. Made some progress, falling asleep on her own before lockdown. Now that's lost. Poor thing. Well, that's amazing that you've made progress before lockdown. I suppose my thinking is always how much it's affecting you and how much it's working or not working for your family. Because you could, if it's not too inconvenient, you could just say, okay, let's pause this for now and let's support her and take more of a gentle approach to supporting her with this. Or you could say, right, we're going to go back to how we were before lockdown, and see if we can try and put those strategies in place again. There's two very different schools of thoughts on this, particularly when it comes to kind of settling children at night. Some psychologists will tell you, no, you need to be really firm, and you kind of need to stick to the guidelines and put them to bed and just kind of walk out, whatever it is that you need to do. And then there'll be another school of thought which will tell you, let's have more of a gentle approach, because we want to support a child in their anxiety. I suppose I would perhaps fall a bit more into that camp and think about how you can support them in a bit more of a gentle approach. It sounded like whatever you were doing before lockdown worked. It might be that you could try that again, but in a more graduated way. I'm not sure what it was that you did. I don't think there'd necessarily be any harm in trying to take it a bit more slowly and a bit more easily during this period. However, that's only if it's not causing too much stress for you as a family, because, you know, we're in a situation where I know some parents are having to kind of stay in the bedroom until 10 o'clock at night with their child, and then they're not getting an evening to themselves, and then that's not really helpful. But, you know, it could, again, actually, Sarah Ockwell-Smith is a brilliant source for supporting those kinds of sleep issues in children. And did you say fear of the dark? But she could be a useful resource for you to tap into. Or you could sort of try and gently revisit it again. But I think what you could do is, if you knew what the anxieties were about, you could try and help her to kind of process those a bit more and talk to you about them a bit more, and then gently try and put in place what you did before. Yeah, sorry, it's tricky to know what to suggest without knowing the full situation. But I think maybe be reassured by the fact that if it worked before, it will probably work again. It might just take a bit of time. That's a relief. My husband instinct is to wait because my own anxiety, yeah, that's the thing, isn't it? If your anxiety is high too, you need to be calm and consistent. And if it's okay, I think take the pressure off yourself. If it's working for you and it's kind of okay for now, then I just think just do it.
So we move on to the next question. There was Nicole who asked the question just after. So can you see it?
Oh,
she was talking about any strategies to help her child who's doing online learning at home and taking no breaks or exercising, and it really impacting his behavior. So he's so enticed with playing games on the laptop. And what she's doing, you know, she just can't get him to take breaks. So any thoughts on that? So
very enticed to play games on the laptop, then take breaks. And all my strategies seem to not be with anxiety. So I wonder if is he taking breaks to play games on the laptop, but not taking breaks to go outside? Yeah.
Answer that the anxiety is with the family, you know, because of this obsessive behaviour in a way.
Yeah, it's really tricky, isn't it? I wonder whether, because this is such a tough time for everybody, I do wonder whether it's about, because it depends what the school's like, doesn't it? How much pressure you're getting from school to do all that work, whether he could still have the same amount of time on his playing his games, but maybe, I don't know, can that be used as an incentive for going out? So for example, could he have longer on his games if he goes out and gets exercise? Would that work? Is he amenable to those, or is it just kind of, because for some children it's their right, isn't it, to play on their games, and there isn't kind of that ability to negotiate. But if you're able to say you can negotiate and you can have more time on your computer, but only if you're going out and getting outside and having some exercise, particularly, I mean, if it wasn't impacting on his behaviour, I would be kind of tempted to say maybe you just kind of have to roll with it, but because it is impacting on his behaviour, I'd be interested to know what the strategies you've tried and what hasn't worked. So yes, he's taking breaks to play games and not go out. We said that to have games as a reward after school, but it's not working. He has common entrance exams coming up, so anxious anyway. And he's 12 years old. So when you say it's not...
Just unmute, or I'm trying to unmute Nicole. So
hi, sorry, I've unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I can hear you. Yeah, so is it that when you say that having the game as a reward isn't working, does that mean he goes on it anyway, or does it mean he'll just say, oh, I won't play my game then?
Yeah, no, because it's been downloaded onto the laptop, he'll just be enticed to play it. So we've sort of said, you know, you can have it even as long as you like after school. It just means having the breaks during the day, so it doesn't really impact his behaviour as such. But even that's not working. You know, it just becomes a battleground, and especially when he's got to go back into class and online. I mean, I've been having the battles with him, but I'm trying to reduce everyone's anxiety when it comes around, you know, to that. Yesterday it got so much, I ended up putting a pin on the app, so I could actually download this app that could put a pin on so he couldn't access the game. Found a way around it. I was just like, yeah, so it's kind of, even though I've kind of said, look, at the end of the day, if you have those breaks because of, you know, the health benefit to him, where he's at a school where he has lots of outdoor time, lots of exercise, you know, and does not have as much screen time, and especially with these exams coming up, it's kind of just a hothouse for the behaviour. And I'm sort of...
Yeah. And was he like that before? Was he like that before lockdown?
No. So we had a good talk about it, and it has been since the lockdown. I mean, at school, you know, he does get a lot of help and assistance. He does, you know, have the breaks as well, a lot of sport, the outdoor time. So it is since lockdown. And because he weekly boards as well, he sort of has that environment where he's used to that structure, the routine and everything, and home's been more of a haven. You know, it's kind of, I'm home now. It's
it's really...
And so I've kind of, you know, relaxed a little bit about some things, but at the same time, I think the impact on behaviour and the anxiety, we're not finding a middle ground. We're not sort of, you know, finding a balance.
Yeah. And I think for a lot of young people, they're kind of entering into this world of computer games, and TV is a way of coping, because it's kind of just a sort of fantasy world, and it's a way of escaping from all this kind of challenges that's going on. And it's tricky, isn't it? Because it is impacting on his behaviour. But do you think that's because it's causing arguments because you're trying to insist he does one thing, but actually he's doing another? Or do you think it's because he's having too much screen time?
I think it's too much screen time. It's no sort of outdoor time, you know, and even where I've sort of said, you know, you can't have, you know, the electronics until we've exercised, or, you know, we were doing some bike rides in the early days. And he even cut that down to doing a very short bike ride just to come back but at least he was getting outside, and at least, you know, it was something. Until that stopped now. And
are there any barriers to kind of taking the laptop away at certain times of the day?
Not during the day, because he's sort of in and out of class time. There's sort of an independent work, which is an hour. And of course, he doesn't do the independent work. It's, you know, again, back on to playing the game. And then, you know, the hour over lunch, or an hour and a half over lunch. So it's a very long time. And we've talked about the impact it is having on his behaviour, and, you know, just having a healthy balance. Where he can, you know, earn it for the end of the day, but it's just really battleground. It's just
I almost wonder whether you can get the school involved and kind of get them to say, because some schools, you know, will be quite receptive to this kind of thing, where they'll say, okay, you're not doing your independent working. If he's not doing it anyway, can the school agree with the school that at that time, like, they share with you the times when he's doing his independent work, and that's the time you have his laptop and you do a kind of bike ride together? Or, you know, even if he refuses to come out with you, it's a time when he's not on his laptop and he has to find something else to do. It might be that you need the support of the school, if they're supportive school, so that they're kind of saying to him, okay, this time you're not doing your learning, or they could come up with a time for you when you can take the laptop away. And it might initially be met with anger, but if you're kind of firm with it and stick with it, I wonder whether that might be your only solution, really. Otherwise it might be a case of kind of just the lowering your expectations and kind of taking the pressure off yourself to try and entice him to do these different things.
I mean, he's got the headmaster's, you know, very relaxed and easy to talk to, and he's going to give him a call tomorrow morning and just have a chat, sort of.
Okay, fantastic.
You know, to see what he's...
So we move on to Liz, who's a mum who's trying to work and homeschool her boys. So she's got a 6 and 8 year old.
Gosh.
And obviously spending a lot of time with them. But she's finding the kids are anxious and will not go to bed, and they're in and out of bed. And so by the end of the evening, when she manages to eventually sit down and do her work at sort of 10:30 in the evening, she's working for the early hours.
Oh, it's awful.
It sounds as though there's a lot of anxiety going on. Any thoughts for Liz?
Yeah, I'm just wondering whether it's because this is I'm hearing a lot of people say this at the moment, that bedtime is becoming really, really late. I'm just wondering, is it anxiety, or is it that they're kind of not tired out enough, just because inevitably, because of the situation, we're not getting as much vitamin D, we're not getting as much exercise, or is it anxiety? Not tired. Yeah. Oh, it's just such a difficult situation, isn't it? And such a common one as well. I mean, this is such a challenging time, because is there anything, I suppose the only thing you can do if they're not tired, is there anything you can do to make them more tired? Whether that's kind of getting them up earlier, I don't know what time they wake up in the morning, getting them up earlier, getting them out earlier for exercise. They do say that the earlier sunlight, the earlier morning sunlight, is when you can get the best kind of vitamin D, which will then help with sleep. So that's a possible option. You could get them to go out and do more physical things, whether it's trying to get them to do more kind of online Joe Wicks type stuff, or whatever there is out there, just more enforced exercise in the day if they're not tired. But that's really challenging if you're also trying to work as well. But if it's, this is where the ABC comes in, it's quite helpful. What's the cause? If they're not tired, is there anything you can possibly do? It might be useful to put them to bed a bit later as well. Although that doesn't help with your evening work situation, but again, it's kind of adjusting expectations. At least then you don't have that frustration of, oh God, they keep coming down, I'm trying to do my work, and that raises our stress levels, doesn't it? Whereas if you just think, okay, fine, I'll put them to bed an hour later, and then I know that I've not got that stressful time in between, or they go to bed and they read for an hour, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, having a bit of quiet time, maybe a bit earlier, so that they start winding down.
Yeah,
it's difficult because it's light outside, so it's sort of it's still daytime.
Checking in with the sleep hygiene, and also just is there anything that can be done to tire them out more in the day?
Actually, I think that ties in very nicely with Emma's question. She was also talking about impact on sleep.
Yeah,
and people either not being tired or overtired, which also has a balance, a counterbalance, which is not very helpful.
We did actually put together a sleep problems leaflet that's on the EHS website, so I could always share that with you in there. And also a while ago, for a separate sleep workshop that I helped run, I put together a little sheet with calming techniques and very, very small little strategies that you can put into place just around bedtime hygiene and setting routine around the bedtime, sensory things as well, which might be helpful. So I can always pass that on to you as well, Annette, which might...
That would be wonderful. And then we can share that. We'll add some of that to our newsletter.
Yeah. And you could get them to listen to the story tape and give them rewards for staying in bed even if they're not asleep, so that you can get on with what you need to do. Just where there's a comment here from, it's up a bit. I know that we're due to finish now, but somebody here asked a question about the empathy side of things. Where is it now? I don't want to miss anybody.
Was it Anita's question? You mentioned not being punitive when behaviours are aggressive towards others, but more empathetic.
Yes. I can't find it now. Would you mind?
I struggle with this even when I know the underlying reason is anxiety or impulsivity. Can you suggest a response which is less punitive, but will help with understanding why it is a wrong thing to do?
Yeah, it's really hard, and you won't be able to do it all the time because it can be really infuriating. So you're not going to be able to do it. Sometimes you are going to be punitive and you are going to come across as stress. That's fine. Don't be hard on yourself, because we're only humans, and it takes all your strength to be able to put something like pace in place. But I suppose the idea is that you're still putting a kind of consequence in place for the behaviour, but you're doing it in a way which is kind of understanding. So you're not like letting them get off stress free. And so I suppose it's just saying, and sometimes you might need to go off and calm down first before you do it. So to say, I just need to take a moment to calm down, because again, that's modelling with good behaviour, but then coming back and saying, that wasn't right, that it wasn't a good way to behave. I know that you're feeling really worried, and I understand, and I'm sorry that you feel that way, but you know that when you behave that way, we have to do this. Next time, let's try and put the strategies in place, and then you can start to put a plan together to if you kind of notice the situation brewing, or as soon as you notice that they're going into that ragey behavior, whatever it might be, to give a non-verbal cue to try and encourage them to go off and do something else, to give them rewards for that. It's a bit of a process, and that takes energy, doesn't it, and kind of headspace to do that. So now might not be the best time to try and tackle that sort of thing. It's not easy. It's a hard thing to try and master. You have to take some very deep breaths as a parent to be able to find that empathy. You have to dig quite deep sometimes, I think. But it can be useful because it can help to slowly chip away at the behaviour, I think. Yeah.
Great. Well, I think it's time to finish off. And I think we've got through all the questions because there were some overlaps. Tamsin and Gemma, thank you very much. It was a really great talk. You touched on a lot of really interesting aspects and also giving us some really helpful pointers. And if you could be so good to share with us some of the further suggestions you have.
Yes,
we'd love to share them, with the rest of the participants. So thank you very much.
Thank you to everybody, and I'm sure you're all doing brilliantly, and just be kind to yourselves in this difficult time. That's the most important thing. Thank you, Annette.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye. Bye.